What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Antoine Malone, and welcome to a place where we can have candid Christian conversation, civil yet serious. That's a new addition we've added, civil yet serious. I was in a conversation recently, and the tension of being a Christian in these spaces right now, where there's a lot of sort of culture war conversations, is a lot of the conversations are very serious conversations that should be had, and yet they're very divisive. And so how does a Christian engage these very serious things that we should not ignore, and yet do so in a way that isn't divisive? It's a very tricky line to walk. And so what we're going to try to do here on my channel is we want to try to have civil but serious conversations. We're not going to run away from tough things, but we're also not going to come in with this pugnacious spirit, attacking people. Instead, we want to talk about the ideas. And so today we're going to talk about, should critical race theory be taught in schools? Now, I have already done this a couple of times on a podcast that I'm a part of called Colored Commentary. You should go check that out if you haven't before. You can just look that up on wherever you listen to podcasts. And we've kind of talked about it around town a little bit, but I thought I'd come on this channel with you and share some of my thoughts and try to distill some things down into maybe a 15 or 20 minute video that may be able to help you and I discuss, or just you and other people discuss this very serious conversation about critical race theory and its involvement in our schools. Now, the first thing that I want to do is define critical race theory. There's no way you can ask the question, should critical race theory be taught in schools, without actually understanding what critical race theory is. And here's what I've learned. I've learned that it really doesn't matter what the real definition of critical race theory is. What really matters is what the person is thinking in their head when they say critical race theory. So for a second, I am going to offer my definition of what critical race theory is in a minute, but I also want to not get too put off by the fact that people are using this term without properly understanding what it is. We are going to talk about some of the myths of CRT because I think it's helpful for this conversation as we get into it. But it's important to understand that people mean something when they say critical race theory, and it may not be what it academically is. What's important in the conversation, though, is to understand what they do mean, what it is that they're afraid of, and what they're fearful of, and to address that thing rather than sit here and argue about whether critical race theory is what they think it is. But with all that being said, we're going to try to offer what I have come across, the three main things, especially as it pertains to schools, that people mean when they say critical race theory. So here's number one. The first thing that people say when it comes to critical race theory, actually people don't say this. This is my definition. And so I would say that critical race theory academically should mean this: the legal discipline. It's a legal discipline of evaluating legislation and its effect on race relations. Critical race theory is a legal discipline of evaluating legislation, that's laws, and their effect on race relations in society. To say that different, critical race theory thinks critically about the effects on race by legislation. That's the critical and the race part of critical race theory. Thinks critically about the laws and their effect on racial relations in society. The implication of those laws on the rights and freedoms and opportunities that should be afforded to every American in our country. Now, most people, when they talk about CRT, they are not thinking about CRT this way. They're thinking about CRT in a couple of the other ways, and I'm going to get into in just a minute. But it's important to note that for me, this is the proper definition of what critical race theory is: a legal discipline designed to evaluate the legislative effects on race relations in society. In what ways do the laws help or hurt promote racial equality and where appropriate, equity in society. It doesn't promote equity across the board. That's another video, but it does ask the question whether the law is contributing to unjust and unjust outcomes. All right, most people aren't talking about critical race theory that way when they come to the conversation. They should be, but they're not. The second approach that people have, and we're going to answer the question about whether critical race theory should be taught in schools in light of all three of these potential definitions. Okay, so the second one is if by critical race theory you mean any conversation that involves race and unflattering historical facts of one race toward another, then you may feel like this question is important. In other words, some people come to critical race theory and what they're thinking critical race theory is all about is about teaching historical negative facts about America's history where it pertains to race. And the fear associated with this is that doing that is going to promote a sense of shame and self-hatred of white kids throughout the country, but also a sense of unpatriotism, if that's a word, or the lack of patriotism toward America as a whole, and we will lose pride in who we are as a country, and then begin to feel this sort of shame and guilt. And so most people, when they're thinking about critical race theory as it pertains to history and the way the history is taught, what they're afraid critical race theory is there to do is to create shame and guilt in their children by teaching them unflattering historical facts about race. And again, this is not what CRT is. There's nothing in critical race theory that states its objective as teaching kids in America and producing shame and guilt in kids as a result of their racial past. It's not even there to blame or have them carry the responsibility of their forefathers. Critical race theory uses racial history in America to learn from the laws that were created then, and to learn why those laws were created in order to combat those instincts, those social instincts that we have in our legislative realms, and to learn from bad laws that didn't produce the proper outcomes, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So critical race theory is concerned with historical history, but as it pertains to understanding the process of lawmaking and the effect of lawmaking, so in order to learn from it, in order to be able to make better laws in the future. That all being said, some people aren't hearing the legislative part. All they hear is the racial history part, and they think that it's unpatriotic. Number three is some people, when they ask the question, should critical race theory be taught in school, what they mean by CRT is that basically any unpleasant, probably the words like divisive conversation around race that shows up in the classroom. And it doesn't matter whether it's history, whether it's current events, whether it's whatever it is. Critical race theory is this broad umbrella to these folks that anything to do with a race relationship, anything to do with racial conversation and injustice or anything in that space, people are worried that is critical race theory, and therefore those racial conversations should not be had in schools altogether. So those are the three things. Critical race theory is either the legal discipline of evaluating legislation on the effect of race and race relationships in society. It's a conversation about unflattering historical facts concerning race for one racial group against another, and you can swap out which racial groups you want to include in that. Or it's just a general broad conversation that's negative, quote unquote negative, about race that doesn't produce positive things. Okay, so these are the three things. So if someone comes to you, or if you find yourself in a conversation and they're saying, I don't think critical race theory should be taught in school, you should ask them, what do you mean by critical race theory? What exactly are you talking about? Because the answer to the question as to whether critical race theory should be taught in school is different based on what it is they may be meaning when they say critical race theory. Now let's talk about number one. Actually, before we do that, let's deal with a couple myths, right? So, and then we'll talk about whether we should teach this or not. So, myths of critical race theory. Here's the first myth. The first myth of critical race theory is that it teaches that all white people are racist or innately immoral. The reason we're going through these myths is because they inform the misinformation about critical race theory and therefore creates the energy that affects your decision of whether it should be should be taught in schools or not taught in school. So I think we should know what critical race theory actually is and does, and be wary of the false accusations that are being attributed to it. Number one, first myth is it teaches that all white people are racist or innately immoral. And this is basically, if you grew up watching Malcolm X or were familiar with that whole movement, then you're familiar with the white devil and this concept that all white people are devils and it doesn't matter, whatever, they're just innately devils because they're white. Critical race theory does not teach that. Critical race theory, again, focused on legislation, is picked up on the historical reality that when legislation and laws are passed, typically those passing the laws want to find some benefit for themselves in the passing of that law, or doesn't want to find a detriment to themselves in that law. In other words, they would rather pass a law that they win from or they benefit from. Typically, one of the tenets of critical race theory is interest convergence, and that's kind of where this comes from. Now, we've stretched that out to mean that all white people are negative and evil and moral, but I don't think that critical race theory is covering that broad of a spectrum. It's not looking at every individual and their individual choices. It's concerned with the law and therefore concerned with the system, right? Not with individuals. It's concerned with the law and therefore concerned with the system, and is picked up on the pattern it suggests in this theory that over time, if we're not careful, we will only pass laws that we benefit from, and we will not pass laws, even if they're corrective laws that should be passed, that we don't benefit from. So it's picked up on that. So it's a myth that all white people are racist or innately immoral. There's more to that, right? But it's suffice to say that that's a myth. The second myth is it teaches that CRT teaches that all people of color's problems come from white people. In other words, that race is the single cause of all black people or people of color's problems. Again, critical race theory doesn't teach that all problems have the single source of white people as the their problem, or of race as their problem. What critical race theory does, however, focus in on is how the problems of the people of color communities are affected by the laws in disproportionate ways. And so if it locates that the law is contributive or facilitates unjust outcomes, it wants to bring that up, unjust outcomes as it pertains to race and racial categories, wants to bring that up, correct it, and then learn why it was made in the first place in order to not make more like them in the future. So it does not locate all problems of people of color in white people or in race, but it does recognize that race has played historically and still plays on some level a significant role, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on the outcomes of racialized social groups in our country. And the third myth is it changes the path to God from Jesus to social justice. So there's a lot of this in the Christian community, and more books are going to come out that try to label critical race theory as the trailblazer for a quote unquote social gospel that trails the path of salvation as a racialized path. In other words, if you want to be saved and loved by God and enter into heaven, then you got to figure out this race problem. Critical race theory, first of all, that's ridiculous. Second of all, critical race theory says nothing about religion, God, salvation, the afterlife, or any such things as that. Anything about a religion and salvation, right? Critical race theory doesn't deal with. Again, CRT is dealing with very specifically laws and how those laws affect racial relationships. That has no bearing on, or has no bearing on religion, has no bearing on salvation, sin, the gospel, none of that. And so the path to God is still through Jesus. He is the only way. It is not through social justice or the correcting of racialized or bad laws. It's just that those laws, especially in a country where we have a say, are laws that we should look at and evaluate and make sure that we make the best that it can possibly be. So no, doesn't change the path from God to God, from Jesus to social justice. This is another myth, and a big one. We'll continue to hear it probably for the next year and read about it in many publications. Okay, so let's get to the fundamental end of the question. So should critical race theory be taught in schools? Well, if the definition of critical race theory in that conversation is the legal discipline of evaluating legislation and its effects on race relations in society, I say the answer is yes. Obviously not in kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth grade. We didn't get taught that stuff at that age. We didn't get taught about slavery until fourth and fifth and sixth grade, I believe, when I was younger. So when age appropriate, sure. But I think the practice of criticizing and evaluating laws, whether by race or any other metric, is positive. We should always be looking for ways to make the best laws possible. And you're only going to get there, that level of improvement, by evaluating the laws that you created in the past to see if they were actually effective at creating the outcomes that they were meant to create. And if not creating the outcome, not being in the way of those outcomes. So I think that this concept of evaluating laws and its effect on race is something that we should always be, should be in our toolbox, if you will, going forward. And I see no problem with teaching the critical thinking necessary to evaluate legislation as it pertains to race. Now, if we have this second idea, if you find yourself in the conversation, it's not about the legal stuff, but it's about history and America's historical facts. Again, I say yes at an appropriate time in school. In the primary education, again, we're teaching critical thinking, and it isn't fatalist. It isn't inevitable that by teaching your historical mistakes that you're going to produce shame and guilt. The truth is, America has been and continues to be on a progressive journey of figuring out how to best deal with the melting pot, which is a very unique environment for a country, in our world. How to do that in a way that honors everyone and gives them the appropriate amounts of justice and freedom and rights. And so as we learn how to do that, right, let's say it's from 1 to 20 on the spectrum. Well, in the past, we were on stage, we're on level 1. And it may be that today we're on level 10, and we made a bunch of mistakes between 1 and 10, and we can look back at those mistakes and see those. But man, we can be progressive in the sense that we can see that negative. Oh, I said progressive, and I'm sure that probably shook some of you. I don't mean progressive in the political sense. I mean the literal term of progression, meaning progress. We can see the progress from where we were to where we are and realize we're not yet where we're going. And we can pass the torch from one generation to the next to help us continue to move that forward. So teaching that history for where we were to where we are to where we want to be is not shame inducing. It's actually something to be proud of and something to inspire our next generation to continue to carry the torch. Teaching our negative history and how we've overcome that negative history is an inspiration, or at least can be an inspiration for our next generation, not something to be ashamed of, not something to lose your sense of pride in your country, not a vehicle for creating hate for America, but instead a torch to pass on and say, hey, let's continue this movement forward and continue to do what we need to do to realize what America wants to realize, which is this whole justice and freedom for all thing. So progress is inspirational, and therefore at the right moment, teaching negative history quote unquote negative history, or at least history that we can learn from, and then acknowledging the mistakes that we've made, acknowledging the progress we've made, and passing on that sense of progress and responsibility to the next generation is precisely how things should go. We should not be hiding from the things in our past. And then lastly, if you're in this conversation and you believe that CRT, this person just means they don't want to have race conversations in school at all, and it's not about history, it's actually about all of it, right? Usually it's about all of it except law. Everything except what critical race theory actually is. But I digress. If they have this conversation, they just don't want to hear about stuff, current events and all that, I would say that this should not be necessary in schools. I can see where a particular class later in high school may propose some current event questions and again, teach critical thinking about it and provide perspective. Critical thinking requires perspective. And so in order to provide the perspective, you might get into some of that history and such. I can see where it may be useful in some cases, but I don't think that having these conversations is absolutely necessary, and therefore it does not need to be taught in school. It could be, but it may not. It doesn't need to be. And I certainly would be against any teaching that grabs onto these myths associated with CRT, any teaching that teaches that all white people or all people of any particular race or any particular negative attribute. I would be against any of those teachings. I'll be against the idea that race is the single problem of all people of colors, the single cause of all people of color problems. I would be against those sort of teachings in schools because I don't believe those things to be true. And in that case, that is indoctrination. And I'll be first in line to say, hey, we shouldn't be teaching that in schools. But these first couple of things I think we can teach. So that's a really, really quick way to have the conversation. Hopefully I didn't take too much of your time, but I really would love to hear from you and what you think. First of all, what do you think about the 3 different forms of critical race theory? And when you're in conversation, can you pick up on these 3 different sort of approaches or redefinitions in some cases of what critical race theory is? And then what do you think about the myths associated with critical race theory? And certainly, what do you think about whether the critical race theory should be taught in schools? Love to hear it. Again, civil yet serious. This is Candid Christianity. My name is Antoine. Hope to see you in the comments soon. Hope this was a blessing to you. Have a great rest of your day.